Welcome to The Tax Factor, the top 20 business and investment podcast from Blick Rothenberg, the tax, accounting and business advisory firm. This week with Rehana, Earle and Melissa Thomas.
Welcome to The Tax Factor, the top 20 business and investment podcast series from Blick Rothenberg. I'm Rehana Earle, and joining me this week to talk about all things tax is my colleague Melissa Thomas. Melissa, so apologies for all the empty marshmallow bags in here. I believe Heather and Roger were clearly doing some major research after last week's show, but welcome along. And what has caught your eye this week, Melissa, in the tax world?
Well, Rehana, we don't have consumables this session, but it's been an interesting week with HMRC winning another IR35 case, Italy rolling out the red carpet to lure UK nationals, and the impending demise of the Body Shop. So many teenage memories of tubs of cocoa butter and hemp hand cream possibly slipping away through our proverbial fingers. That and further updates from Labour around their intention to crack down on anti-avoidance and the increasing number of pensioners falling into tax.
So yes, there is a lot to talk about in this episode, Melissa. So shall we start with what the Labour Party have been announcing as they share more of their election pledges? And something that Heather and Roger touched on in the last episode is Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves' plans to crack down on tax evasion, something that we've heard before. Labour believes that they can raise a potential $6 billion a year by funding HMRC with another $555 million and adding more than 5,000 additional tax officers to HMRC. According to Reeves, the tax gap is about $36 billion at the moment, but she believes if HMRC are properly resourced and crack down on tax avoidance with the relevant application of the tax code in the correct way, they will be able to add an additional $6 billion in revenue, leaving another $30 billion, so not a short order, to find in the coffers. And some of that, I think, will come from the proposed changes to the non-dom tax regime, but more on that later. There are, however, some questions, I think, about how quickly HMRC can ramp up. And our CEO, Nimesh Shah, commented that Labour's claims of this tenfold return on investment in additional tax revenue seem to be incredibly ambitious, particularly at a time when HMRC are struggling just to answer their phones. The last 10 years, we've seen quite a significant amount of investment into funding HMRC, along with increased legislative powers to tackle tax evasion, as well as aggressive tax avoidance. And in fact, in the last 3 years, the government announced additional funding to HMRC of $900 million. But the reality is the tax gap remains at about 5%, which is similar to levels in 2017-2018. So even as tax revenues have increased, the absolute amount of the tax gap at $36 billion has never been higher. So thinking about it, Labour's proposals to increase boots on the ground, as well as investing in digital transformation, these are all sensible proposals on paper, but I think what we actually need is some proper strategy on tax and some future direction of HMRC. And again, as Nimesh has said, this piecemeal investment isn't going to solve anything in the long run, and it doesn't really inspire confidence from taxpayers that the tax gap will probably be addressed in the long term. So I think what we're all looking for is some much better transformation of the UK tax system, and ultimately to simplify it going forward.
Completely agreed, Rehana. The reality is we're seeing basic HMRC customer service standards continue to slip. So getting additional tax inspectors will be great, but there also needs to be a focus on core support for taxpayers. It was reported in February of this year that 3/4 of people who phoned HMRC had to wait an average of 24 minutes for anyone to answer, and a total of over 650,000 calls were abandoned. In January, which is the busiest time for self-assessment filing, HMRC redirected over a third of calls to automated systems, whilst over 840,000 calls were not answered. 71% of callers had to wait more than 10 minutes to get through to an agent, which is up on the 68% from January of last year. So whilst there is some evidence that people are using other channels, more including HMRC web chat functionality, it's still clearly the preference to speak to a human being. And despite this fact, HMRC made announcements earlier this year that it planned to close the self-assessment helpline phone lines for 6 months. This announcement was heavily criticised, and so HMRC have had to backtrack on that decision. CIOT President Gary Ashfeld said HMRC's digital services are still far from fully functional, and the answers can still be difficult or impossible to find online.
So based on what you're saying, Melissa, I think there's certainly a lot of work to be done. And I do hope that whichever party does come into power will really look at the tax system and really take a close look at how HMRC are actually operating in practice, rather than continuing to take this kind of sticking plaster approach and making claims around the types of revenue that they'll be able to get from them. So turning, however, now to a positive for HMRC. So there has been a recent upper tribunal ruling in favour of HMRC. And this time it's in relation to Sky football pundit Neil McCann, who was formerly a Scottish Premiership football player. In this case, HMRC was seeking to recover approximately £210,000 under the IR35 rules. Mr. McCann argued that the rules did not apply to his company, but the upper tribunal agreed that his contract with Sky was one of employment, and therefore that national insurance payments should have been made for the work that he carried out between 2013 and 2018.
Rehana, do you see this focus on TV personalities coming to an end, or is this still the thin end of the wedge?
So, I definitely think there's some lack of sympathy out there from ordinary people towards these kind of more highly paid and rewarded individuals who are a bit more high profile and have been having these long running battles with HMRC. But I think, in fact, in a lot of these cases, people aren't really setting out to break the rules. These cases do go back a number of years, and there's been, a lot of changes to the rules over that time, but they also remain really complex, which goes back to our point of kind of simplification earlier on. I think, as always, the advice has to be that those who might be impacted by IR35 should get their circumstances reviewed. Ultimately, regardless of what they have written down on paper in terms of contracting or agreements, they may not translate into actual working practices in every case. And, when it goes to something like, tribunal or to court, of course, all of the facts are going to be considered. So I suspect this isn't going to be the last case that we see at all, and there'll be more to come in the future. So now, turning to our memories, Melissa, I think, as teenage girls, of which I have many hours spent perusing the various lip balms and body creams in the Body Shop. What has been happening to this institution, this British institution for teenage girls?
Well, another high street name falls. The Body Shop, which famously was founded by Anita Roddick back in 1976, entered administration in February of this year. A recent article in The Times disclosed that the administrators are seeking a plan under a company voluntary arrangement, a CVA, to reduce the company's tax bill when it returns to profitability to provide extra cash to its creditors who have incurred losses after its collapse. Whilst Aurelius, the current owners, as of November 2023, secured itself as the priority creditor after administration, it has confirmed that it will not seek repayment from the administration, which should leave more funding for what I'd refer to as second-tier creditors, such as HMRC and trade suppliers. The administrators have prepared a plan to retain tax benefits worth around £66 million, which were built up before the business went into administration. These are broadly comprised, as we understand it, of tax losses that could be used to reduce corporation tax in future years if the company can exit administration and resume solvent trading. In this arrangement, if creditors vote through a CVA, they should be in line to secure a dividend reflecting the value of the tax asset, which for retail groups is often used to reduce a retailer's rent bill and often used to escape individual unprofitable shop or restaurant leases. We've seen similar arrangements put in place for Jamie's ItalyIn, Byron Burger and Prezzo, all of which have recently had CVAs approved. We're seeing chains use CVAs to get out of expensive leases and close branches, or to secure substantial rent reductions to make the sites more viable. The twist with the Body Shop is that the chain has already started to close stores after it was put into administration. While the landlords may miss out, HMRC and other trade creditors may benefit.
So some big names there and some potentially positive news for HMRC by the sounds of it. So from reminiscing on our teenage years, however, to planning ahead for retirement, there's been quite a bit of discussion recently about the triple lock pension guarantee, which has taken the state pension closer to the tax-free allowance threshold. The state pension rose to £11,500 in April, just up by 8.5%, which is just over £1,000 away from the £12,570 tax-free allowance. And if the Conservatives remain in government, the £12,750 is set to remain until 2028. It's therefore estimated that by the time the frozen threshold is lifted, another 1.6 million pensioners will be paying tax. At the moment, there are about 8.5 million pensioners paying income tax, which includes an estimated 1.2 million who have been pushed into paying tax since the tax thresholds were frozen in 2022. So, personally, I think this feels like far from the right answer for pensioners who don't have any other or have other limited sources of income. But for those that do and have additional income and can afford to do so, we might, for example, see some putting more into their ISAs following the new ISA rules that came into effect on the 6th of April. Or we might see them rethink how they're actually working with their current pensions by putting money back into their actual pensions to reduce their overall tax liability. But if people do that, I think they need to be careful and ensure that they are getting the full tax relief if they are still higher rate taxpayers. And this is because typically basic rate relief will be added to pension contributions, but any higher rate payers may need to claim relief through self-assessment.
So potentially more admin and planning for those who've previously not had to consider such matters and being dragged into this new situation through fiscal drag.
Yeah, exactly that, Melissa. I think pensioners really need to be aware of the impact of the frozen bans and make sure that they're planning accordingly, especially if they do have additional funds that they can make use of.
Well, we couldn't do an episode of The Tax Factor without comment about VAT in one way or another. Nothing on consumables, as much as we all love an edible story. However, I've recently seen several clients who are responsible for their own VAT filings start to come up against a new penalty regime that HMRC introduced back last year, which also applies to nil or repayment returns. The new system is points-based for late or non-compliance. There are penalty point thresholds depending on whether your VAT accounting period is annual, quarterly or monthly, and the points for late filing are cumulative. And clients who have filed late last year, maybe not for each VAT accounting period, but for several, are now starting to find they're breaching these penalty thresholds and being issued with set fines and late payment interest. The penalty points don't expire for a couple of years, so it's really important to get your VAT housekeeping in order and file on time. Of course, if you need support, our VAT teams would be delighted to assist.
But turning now to the weather, we're Brits, we like to talk about it. The sun is shining now outside, but no doubt lots of us are still dreaming of warmer weather, especially following the hail and the wind this week. For those seeking the sun, Italy has recently announced it's welcoming Brits to work remotely via a year-long digital nomad visa. The scheme was recently opened for non-EU citizens, but is something that has been talked about in Italy for some time, and that's mainly due to the ageing population over there and a need to drive and boost the Italian economy. There are 6 criteria that need to be met, including having a university or college degree or professional qualification with an accredited organisation, having a work contract and a salary of at least €28,000, which equates to about £24,000, having health insurance, a minimum of 6 months experience in the industry they intend to work remotely in, no immigration crimes, and evidence of a place to stay in Italy. I think this will be attractive to lots of people and is open to both the self-employed and employed. But as tax professionals, there are lots of issues that individuals and employers need to think about if they decide to work remotely.
Yes, that's right. Some considerations, for example, to include whether the individual will break UK tax residence or end up being subject to tax in both jurisdictions. And for employers, consideration needs to be given as to whether there will be any reporting obligations, including for payroll taxes and social security, as well as from a corporation tax perspective.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a huge amount to think about with these types of arrangements. And certainly I or anyone else in my global mobility team would be more than happy to speak to individuals who might be looking to work remotely for a period of time, or to employers who want to allow their employees to work remotely overseas for a period of time. Certainly something that we've seen increased take up on following the pandemic. So with that, we're nearing the end of the show, but it would definitely be remiss not to mention the changes to the non-dom tax regime. On the 9th of April, Labour announced their proposals, including, amongst other things, abolishing the excluded property status and no 50% discount for foreign income in 25-26, which differs from the Conservatives' proposals. We could probably spend hours as tax professionals talking about the proposed changes and the impact that they will have, particularly in the move to try and plug this 36 billion tax revenue gap. And there will definitely be more to come on this in future episodes as more is unveiled. But in the meantime, for those who are interested, we put together a whole section on our website of what the changes could mean. So if you're interested, please go to the Blick Rothenberg homepage and follow the link. With that, my thanks to Melissa for joining me today.
My pleasure. I believe Rob Goodley and Earle are in the presenting seats next week.
I'm Rehana Earle. Thank you for listening and enjoy your weekend.
That's the Tax Factor. We'd like to thank you for making us one of the UK's top 20 podcasts. Find all our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And join us again next time on the Tax Factor.